And I want to start with something that came up a few times yesterday, our current moment, the fact that we now encounter each other digitally and not in person, not body to body. For me, online meetings are a huge challenge as a scholar. How can we understand them without naturalizing them? During the course of yesterday, we spoke about the importance of bodies and embodiment, but what about our virtual embodiments? How do we understand our truncated torsos? What does it mean for an encounter to only see a person's face and upper body? At the moment, we all look a bit like Saussure's talking heads. Rosine spoke yesterday about a moment when she could only see her slides, but could not see any of us. I've had similar moments in online presentations and found them deeply unsettling. In these moments, one feels almost as if one is alone in the world. And I know I would catch myself thinking, what would happen if I would just get up and leave? In the context of my work on digital media, I've often wondered, do digital media, because of their technological affordances, create spaces for monologue rather than dialogue? For example, overlapping speech, something that is common and extremely meaningful in everyday interaction, is largely absent from our Zoom engagements. The discussion about digital encounters and COVID also raises questions of who is excluded from such encounters and who is included and in what ways. So maybe in the current moment, we would want to ask, and here I rephrase Maggie from yesterday morning, what does the act of inclusion look like and sound like on Zoom, on WhatsApp, on Facebook, and so forth? Angela outlined yesterday what I meant to do, that is to discuss the following. What are the theoretical, methodological, and practical themes that emerged in the past 2 days? On the level of theory, I would say, transdisciplinarity stood out as a theoretical approach, not as a methodology, but as an ontology, speaking to the way we see the world and to the way the world is. And just a small note, I prefer trans to inter. The trans prefix, as in translanguaging, speaks to a world beyond disciplines and their colonial histories. It is not disciplines interacting with one another, but rather a vision of going beyond disciplines and thus also beyond the academy. Science and meaning-making featured strongly throughout the discussions. Bodies were another theme, as well as ways of being and feeling, and of course, very centrally, the importance of art. Epistemologically, I felt that throughout there was an ethnographic sensibility at work, a sense of being attuned to social interactions and relations. And I often think that ethnography is not actually something we teach as a method at university. It is part of our ordinary knowledge, the knowledge we have as people living in the world. It reflects our ability to listen and to seek understanding, as well as relation within the worlds that we inhabit. And finally, linked to the idea of listening as social practice, was the discussion that emerged after the keynote about the idea of solidarity, a discussion that resonated very strongly with my own thinking about positionality. I've always found the term ally very problematic. It seems to me to be about the liberal subject, but it misses the deep collective commitment that shapes solidarity. The political scientist Jodi Dean recently suggested that we should rather use the word comrade, and I do like her suggestion. Jodi Dean notes that the word comrade indexes political and affective relations. She writes, no matter their differences, comrades stand together. They are united by a political vision, they dream of a different world, and they actively struggle to achieve this world. A similar vision of solidarity was proposed by Kwame Nkrumah in the 1960s and linked discourses of revolution and African liberation. Comrade first appeared as a term in the 16th century when it referred to a person with whom one would share house and food. Here, closeness was not, as implied by Derrida, grounded in a sense of emotional and affective sameness, but grounded in praxis, in doing and in cohabitation. I like these ideas of solidarity and revolution, where political vision and dreaming allow for connections that are not based on traditional ideas of sameness, but on a common purpose and respect for each other. Linked to this, for me, is also the idea of love for others. We should not be shy to use this word and to liberate it from its romantic connotations. James Baldwin's reflection provides inspiration. Love, for Baldwin, demands psychological and embodied self-transformation. We might not love everyone all the time, but we can engage with others based on a praxis that is informed by love. But I digress. These were some of my reflections and thoughts yesterday evening when I was looking through my notes and thinking back to the discussions. Solidarity and love are two concepts with which I currently work in my own thinking. I was also thinking about something else, namely that I'm not sure that my love and willingness to include is boundless. Are there limits to inclusion? And I'm thinking here of my own work on whiteness and racism. I was taking my cue from Steve Bantubiko and attempted to do this work to unmask whiteness and white supremacy as part of an anti-racist politics. Yet, to study far-right spaces, and my work was focused on digital worlds, would kill me inside. I would end my days in disgust and anger, unable to communicate even with those closest to me. Do I wish for dialogue? Do I wish to engage in acts of inclusion? Is there an art to hearing the racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic other? In their proposal, Maggie and Angela speak about the coarsening of the public sphere, and this is one very visible part of it. Last night, reflecting on this, thinking about it, I was reminded of Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela's book, A Human Being Died That Night. In the book, she writes about her interviews with the state-sanctioned apartheid mass murderer, Eugene de Kock, and how she engaged with him, how she struggled in the process, but how she managed to hold him accountable and to forgive him. What kind of ethical framework can help us in such encounters? Encounters that create a specific form of discomfort, or rather of disgust. How do we hold responsibility in these spaces? And how do we stay true to our political commitments? But let me shift gear and leave these questions maybe for the broader discussion. I've recently become interested in Mara Lugones' idea of witnessing. It is a useful concept. It is not just listening or seeing, an approach that privileges the ear and the eyes, but as we are in each other's presence, we are fully and bodily co-present, feeling with all our senses, witnessing the other, the fullness of their being, their joy and pain, their hopes and anger. Witnessing allows us to experience what Lugones calls the manyness of worlds, and to lead a life that is plurisensical, not monosensical. A plurisensical life is, I would suggest, a life that is magical, artful, attuned to multiplicity and mutuality. It is art in particular that attunes us to the manyness of worlds, that permeates our boundaries and makes them porous, open to receive. And I don't want to try to stay within the 10 minutes I promised. Let me conclude this by identifying some more themes. There was such richness and multitude in yesterday's discussions, and I will also just very briefly comment on today's discussion. There was even a hashtag, flatten the hierarchy, to dissolve the hierarchy between high art and craft, between teachers and students, between art and the academy. Space and time also featured strongly in my notes. This came up in relation to exhibitions. Where should they be staged? And what are their temporalities? It also came up in the context of church services and more broadly in the role that institutionalized spaces play in enabling or preventing the encounters that we can have. The latter also brought up questions of land and ownership. That is the need to be mindful of the fact that many of these spaces are on stolen lands. In the chat, I read the following line, and it stayed with me. Subtle changes in terminology can make huge differences. This is something that resonated, the need to interrogate the words we use not once, but time and again. And in this context, I was also intrigued by observations that were made about the way we introduce ourselves to others. Do we just say our name, announcing our individuality? Or do we indicate our connections and relations, thus making visible our kinship, our histories, and our embeddedness in the social world? And then there were very productive discussions throughout the day and also again today about the need to unsettle language away from its bureaucratic referential function, its standardized straitjacket, and to pay attention to music and magic, feeling, and even to food. We also touched on anger and pain as forms of communication, and on the importance of staying in the moment and paying attention to relational dynamics. There were productive discussions on multidirectional memory, memories as multiple and multivocal, not as competing with one another. Interesting to me was also some thinking around assemblages. Here, the importance of bodies comes back into view, but also the importance of space and of diverse materialities. We touched on social justice, but I thought that maybe this is something one could expand on, especially in view of the literature on decolonization, which has in part critiqued the social justice paradigm, drawing attention to questions of land and reparations, to the redistribution of material resources. And then there were reflections on the link between ethics and aesthetics, taking us back to art. This is a big topic, and I think there's so much space there for engagement and for communication around the relationship between ethics and aesthetics. And I'm still thinking about all that came up in the past 2 days. And finally, then there is the canon. How can we expand the canon that came up in the keynote yesterday that informs our theoretical? And so that was kind of my summary after day one. And I didn't have much time to put something together for day two. But here I'm actually drawing more on some of the work I've done recently on language and music, the relationship between language and music. And so I was really touched, and it was amazing to listen to the music. And as I was listening and all the improvisation, I was thinking about things I've written, not published. This is all very still bubbling, on improvisation in sociolinguistics, the idea of improvisation. And I really like Lewis Gordon's work. He's an African-American, actually, I think Jamaican philosopher. And he writes in Her Majesty's and Other Children about jazz. And I always thought this actually made me think, can we develop as linguists, as social linguists, as social scientists in the academy theories that groove? So not a politics that grooves, but theories that groove, that make us want to dance, that make us want to move. And that actually really engage our whole central being. And the notion I've worked with or am working with thinking around is actually the idea of syncopation and whether we could syncopate our own thinking. And then this is just the quote I love from Herbie Hancock about, and it came up in the improvisation. And of course, improvisation is based on enormous experience, enormous work, enormous knowledge. But I love how he talks here about Miles Davis. So Herbie Hancock, maybe I just read it out. And I remember that we were playing So What? And it was a really hot night. The music was on. Right in the middle of Miles' solo, when he was playing one of his amazing solos, I played the wrong chord, completely wrong. It sounded like a big mistake. And Miles paused for a second, and then he played some notes that made my chord right. He made it correct. Miles didn't hear it as a mistake. He heard it as something that happened, just an event. And so that was part of the reality of what was happening at the moment. And he dealt with it. Since he didn't hear it as a mistake, he felt it was his responsibility to bring in, to find something that fit, that taught me a very big lesson, not only about music, but about life. And I thank you with this, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.